Berlin, 1933. Berlin, 1933. A government inherits a nation on its knees. Unemployment stands at 30%. The treasury holds less than 100 million Reichsmarks in foreign currency, enough to fund Germany for exactly 11 days. By 1939, that same government has built the most mechanized military force in human history: 3,000 tanks, 4,000 aircraft, an army of 1.5 million men uniformed, armed and fed. Where did the money come from? The official answer, economic genius, national willpower, the miracle of rearmament, is the answer they wanted you to believe. The real answer is something far darker and far more ingenious. Germany didn't rebuild its economy. It ran the largest state-sponsored financial fraud in modern history and almost got away with it. If you've never heard the name Hjalmar Schacht, stay with me, because this man did something no economist before or since has ever attempted at national scale. Subscribe to Warzone World War II. You will not learn this in a classroom. The crisis set up. B-roll cue. Weimar Republic breadlines. Hyperinflation footage, 1932 newspaper headlines. To understand the scheme, you first have to feel the weight of what Germany was facing in January 1933. This was not a recession, this was civilizational collapse. The Weimar Republic had been ground down by a decade of catastrophe. The 1923 hyperinflation had destroyed personal savings across an entire generation. At its peak, a single US dollar cost 4.2 trillion Reichsmarks. Not billions, trillions. A loaf of bread cost more than an entire house had a decade earlier. Germans burned paper money in their stoves because it was cheaper than firewood. Then came the Great Depression. By 1932, German industrial output had fallen by 40% compared to 1929. Export revenue had collapsed. Foreign creditors, still owed reparations money from the Versailles Treaty of 1919, were circling. The reparations bill alone was staggering. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed 132 billion Goldmarks on Germany, a figure so large that economists at the time estimated it would take Germany until 1988 to pay it off. Per historian Sally Marks, the real burden was somewhat lower after subsequent negotiations, but the psychological and economic weight was total. Germany had defaulted. The Dawes Plan, the Young Plan, restructuring after restructuring, none of it worked. By 1932, 6 million Germans were officially unemployed. Unofficially, historians estimate the true figure was closer to 8 million. Roughly 1 in 3 working-age men had no job, no income, no future. The German state had no money, not in any meaningful sense. Foreign currency reserves were nearly depleted. The Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, was legally constrained from simply printing money because the memory of 1923 had written those restrictions into law. They had tried inflation once. The nation had nearly torn itself apart, and Germany's international credit was dead. After repeated defaults on reparations payments, no foreign bank would lend Germany meaningful capital. The international financial system had effectively blacklisted the German state. So when Hitler came to power in January 1933, he inherited a nation with no foreign currency, no international credit, massive debt, and 8 million unemployed citizens who were increasingly listening to communists. He needed to rearm Germany and fast. The generals demanded it, his ideology demanded it, his own survival demanded it, but he had no money to do it. This is where Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht enters. The mechanism / the wizard. B-roll cue, Schacht portrait photographs, Reichsbank exterior Berlin, Mefo bill documents. Hjalmar Schacht was not a Nazi. That distinction matters, and it makes what he did more disturbing, not less. Born in 1877 to a German father and an American mother, hence the very American middle name Horace Greeley, after the famous US newspaper editor, Schacht was a career banker. He had served as currency commissioner during the 1923 hyperinflation crisis, and it was largely his intervention that stabilized the collapsing Reichsmark. He was internationally respected, he spoke fluent English, he had friends in the City of London and on Wall Street. He was, in the language of his era, a sound money man. And then he invented something that was the opposite of sound money. Here's how it worked. Germany needed to spend money. It didn't have to buy weapons it couldn't afford from companies that required payment up front. The Reichsbank couldn't print money, though illegal, under its own charter. The government couldn't borrow openly, so no one would lend to them. Raising taxes would destroy what was left of public confidence. Schacht's solution was, at its core, a shell company. A very large, very sophisticated, government-backed shell company. In 1933, the Nazi government quietly established a dummy corporation called Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, the Metallurgical Research Corporation, its initials MEFO. MEFO had a nominal capital of 1 million Reichsmarks. It had no factories, no workers, no research, no metal. It existed for one purpose only, to issue financial instruments, promissory notes, essentially I owe us, called MEFO bills. Here's where it gets interesting. When the German government wanted to place a weapons order, tanks from Krupp, aircraft engines from BMW, artillery from Rheinmetall, the manufacturer didn't receive payment in Reichsmarks. They received MEFO bills instead. Paper instruments, issued by this fictional corporation, guaranteed by the German state, but kept entirely off the official government balance sheet. The manufacturers could then do one of two things with those MEFO bills. They could hold them. They carried a 4% annual interest rate, so they actually appreciated in value. Or they could take them to any German bank and discount them, exchange them for real Reichsmarks at face value. If a bank discounted the bills, that bank could then take the bills to the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, and redeem them for actual currency. Imagine you are the finance minister of a country. You have no money, but you have a printing press you're legally forbidden to use. So instead, you create a company that has its own printing press, hand that company's I owe us to your weapons manufacturers, let the I owe us circulate through the banking system. And by the time real money has to appear, the Reichsbank exchanging bills for Reichsmarks, the transaction is so many steps removed from the original government order that nobody can easily trace it back to deficit spending. It was monetary laundering on a civilizational scale. Schacht had effectively invented a way to print money without printing money. The bills were not technically government debt. They didn't appear in official budget figures. They were invisible to foreign creditors, invisible to international observers, and invisible to the German public, all of whom had been promised fiscal responsibility. Adam Tooze, in his landmark economic history, The Wages of Destruction, describes the MEFO scheme as a brilliant improvisation that allowed the Nazi regime to spend on a scale otherwise utterly impossible given Germany's financial situation. Between 1934 and 1938, the German government issued 12 billion Reichsmarks in MEFO bills. 12 billion in 4 years. On weapons. To put that in context, Germany's entire official government revenue in 1933 was approximately 6.8 billion Reichsmarks. Schacht had found a way to spend almost twice the annual government budget in secret without a single Reichsmark appearing in the official accounts. The scheme in action. B-roll cue. German rearmament footage, Krupp factory footage, Luftwaffe construction, panzer divisions rolling. The MEFO machine didn't start at full speed. It ramped up, deliberately, systematically, in a way that reveals just how precisely Schacht had calculated his fraud. The first MEFO bills are issued. The amounts are modest, a few hundred million Reichsmarks distributed through carefully selected defence contractors. The goal at this stage is simply to test whether the mechanism works, whether manufacturers will accept the bills, whether banks will discount them, whether the Reichsbank will honour them without triggering a currency crisis. It works. Every step functions exactly as Schacht designed. The military begins to move. The Wehrmacht, still officially the Reichswehr, bound by the 100,000-man limit of Versailles, begins quietly expanding. Per Richard Evans in the Third Reich in power. By the end of 1933, Germany had already violated Versailles in at least 17 measurable ways. MFO financing is what makes each violation affordable. The bills begin flowing in serious volume. Krupp Steel, which had been secretly designing tank components for years, disguised as tractors in official records, receives MFO funding to accelerate production. The result? The Panzer I, Germany's first operational tank, rolls off assembly lines the following year. Without MFO financing, the Panzer I doesn't exist in 1935. It possibly doesn't exist at all before 1938. The Luftwaffe, officially a civilian aviation ministry throughout this period, begins constructing airfields, training pilots and ordering aircraft. Heinkel, Dornier, Junkers and a new enterprise called Focke-Wulf are all MFO clients. The Bf 109, which will become the Luftwaffe's primary fighter of the entire war, is designed and prototyped during this exact window of secret MFO-funded research. Each transaction runs the same track. Weapons order placed to MEFO bill issued to bill accepted by manufacturer to bill discounted at regional bank-to-bank presents, bill to Reichsbank to Reichsbank issues, Reichsmarks, manufacturer gets paid, Germany gets weapons, official budget shows nothing. Hitler announces the existence of the Luftwaffe publicly in open violation of Versailles. He introduces conscription, Germany's official military jumps from 100,000 men to a declared target of 500,000. The international community protests. Britain and France express grave concern. Nobody imposes consequences. What the international community doesn't know, what they cannot know, because the books have been falsified, is that Germany's military spending in 1935 alone is 6 billion Reichsmarks. That's more than Britain and France combined are spending on their militaries that year, per wartime economic records cited by Adam Tooze. The deception is total. The 4-year plan is announced. Göring is put in charge of economic coordination. MEFO bills are now the primary funding mechanism for German rearmament. The machine is running at maximum capacity. Schacht begins expressing private reservations, but not moral ones, but actuarial ones. He can see the end of the road approaching. Because the MEFO bills have a problem, they have a maturity date. The bills were issued with 5-year terms. The first batch, issued in 1934, will come due in 1939. At that point, all those I owe us, all 12 billion Reichsmarks of hidden debt, will crystallize into real obligations. The German government will owe real money to real banks, and the real Reichsbank will have to honour them with real currency. That moment, 1939, is also, not coincidentally, the year Hitler invades Poland. The connection between MEFO maturity and the outbreak of war is one of the most debated and disturbing correlations in all of economic history, and you won't find it in most standard dabei zu harmlos narratives. The dark side, it gets worse. B-roll Q, concentration camp forced labour footage, Aryanisation documents, occupied territory looting imagery. Here is where the story turns from financial history into something considerably darker. The MEFO scheme was brilliant, but it had 3 fundamental flaws, and the way the Nazi regime solved each of those flaws reveals the true moral architecture of the system. Reveal 1. The scheme required silence, and silence was enforced by terror. For MEFO bills to work, German manufacturers, bankers and Reichsbank officials all had to participate in what was, functionally, a massive financial deception. They had to issue fake IOUs, accept fake IOUs as payment, and quietly convert fake IOUs into real currency, all while maintaining the public fiction of fiscal responsibility. Schacht knew this. He also knew that in a democracy, this level of coordinated deception across hundreds of private firms would be impossible to maintain. Somebody would talk, an auditor would leak, a journalist would investigate. Germany in 1933 was not a democracy. By the time MEFO bills were circulating, the Gestapo had already begun systematically eliminating independent financial journalism. The editors of German financial newspapers either complied with official narratives or they disappeared. The independent auditing profession, which under the Weimar Republic had operated with genuine independence, was restructured under Nazi-friendly associations by 1934. The mechanism of financial transparency that might have exposed Schacht's scheme was dismantled at the same time the scheme was constructed. The silence wasn't voluntary, it was architectural. Reveal 2. The MEFO scheme was explicitly designed to be replaced by theft. Schacht understood, with mathematical precision, that the bills would come due by 1939 and that Germany had no realistic prospect of paying them through organic economic growth. The Nazis had never intended to. Declassified German Finance Ministry documents, examined in detail by historian Avraham Barkay in Nazi Economics, reveal internal memos as early as 1936 discussing territorial acquisition as the mechanism for resolving the debt crisis. The economic case for expansion into Austria and Czechoslovakia was not incidental to Nazi ideology, it was the balance sheet solution. The Anschluss with Austria in March 1938 immediately transferred 1.4 billion Reichsmarks in Austrian National Bank gold and foreign currency reserves to Berlin. The occupation of the Sudetenland in October 1938 transferred another 1 billion Reichsmarks in Czech industrial assets and military equipment. The full occupation of Czechoslovakia in March 1939 yielded the entire Czech gold reserve, 23.1 metric tons of gold, which had been stored with the Bank for International Settlements in Basel. In other words, the MEFO bills matured in 1939. By 1939, Germany had looted enough gold and industrial capacity from its neighbours to cover them. The war wasn't separate from the financial scheme. The war was the financial scheme's exit strategy. Reveal 3. Forced labour was the hidden subsidy that made the entire system viable. Even with looted gold, even with MEFO bill financing, the German rearmament programme was only economically sustainable because labour, the single largest cost in any industrial economy, was being systematically coerced to work below market wages, and in many cases, for nothing at all. Beginning in 1933, Jewish-owned businesses were subjected to systematic confiscation through Aryanization, a process that transferred property to non-Jewish Germans at prices set by Nazi officials, typically 10 to 30% of actual market value. By 1938, this process had transferred an estimated 6 to 8 billion Reichsmarks in commercial and real estate assets into the German economy at fraudulent prices. By 1939, concentration camp inmates, beginning with political prisoners, later expanding to Jewish people, Roma, Soviet POWs, and occupied populations, were being leased by the SS to private German corporations, including IG Farben, Siemens, and BMW. The camps charged corporations 4 to 6 Reichsmarks per prisoner per day. The prisoners received nothing. The MEFO bill scheme is often discussed in isolation as a clever piece of financial engineering, but it was designed from the beginning as the first layer of a multi-layered system of economic violence. Without forced labour and territorial plunder, the bills come due and the economy collapses. Schacht's financial brilliance did not function independently of Nazi brutality. It was dependent on it. The collapse verdict. B-roll cue. Schacht at Nuremberg, bombed Berlin 1945. German economic collapse footage. Hjalmar Schacht saw the end coming before almost anyone else. By 1937, he was sending private memoranda to Hitler warning that the rearmament economy had reached its limits. Inflation was beginning to creep back, consumer goods were disappearing from shelves, the foreign currency situation remained precarious. Germany was spending 17% of its GNP on military expenditure by 1938, a wartime level of spending in nominal peacetime. Per Adam Tooze, the wages of destruction. Hitler ignored him. In November 1937, Schacht resigned as Minister of Economics. In January 1939, he was dismissed as president of the Reichsbank after submitting a final memo warning that continued spending would cause currency collapse. He was right about the economics. He had been wrong about everything else. The MEFO scheme did not fail in the way Schacht feared. Germany resolved its debt obligations not through economic policy, but through military conquest, exactly as those 1936 Finance Ministry memos had anticipated Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, France. The occupied territories did not merely provide strategic advantage, they were functionally debt repayment vehicles. And then the war turned. And the whole system inverted. By 1944, Germany was financing its war by printing actual currency, the thing Schacht had built his entire scheme to avoid, and extracting resources from occupied Europe through outright looting at a scale that historian Götz Ali estimates transferred 2,700 Reichsmarks per occupied person into the German war economy. The sophistication of the early years gave way to brute extraction. The German economy that surrendered in May 1945 had been running on financial fiction for 12 years. The counterintuitive verdict? The MEFO scheme didn't fail. It succeeded so completely, so brilliantly, that it gave Hitler the weapons he needed to start a war, and then the war itself became the scheme's only possible continuation. Schacht built a machine that could only be fed by conquest. Once conquest failed, the machine died. What does this tell us? First, economic statistics can be falsified at a national scale for years, even in a sophisticated industrialized economy, if information control and political terror are applied simultaneously. The international financial community failed to detect the MEFO scheme for the entire 4 years it operated. Second, debt doesn't disappear when it's hidden. The 12 billion Reichsmarks in MEFO obligations didn't evaporate. They were resolved through the annexation of Austria, the looting of Czechoslovakia, the occupation of Poland, and eventually the deaths of tens of millions of people. Every hidden debt has a cost. History always presents the bill. Third, the individuals who design these systems are not necessarily ideological monsters. Schacht was tried at Nuremberg and acquitted. The tribunal found insufficient evidence that he'd known the full extent of what his financial tools would enable. He lived until 1970. He wrote his memoirs. He called himself a resistance figure. Whether that acquittal was justice or a failure of justice is a question historians still debate, which brings us to the question I want to leave you with. Hjalmar Schacht built a machine that secretly funded one of history's greatest atrocities. He later claimed he didn't know what the machine would be used to do. His financial instruments were neutral, only the purposes to which they were put were criminal. Does the designer of a weapon bear responsibility for how it is used? Leave your answer in the comments. I'll be reading them.